Shalom. Welcome to the Jewish View. My name is Rabbi Nachman Simon with the Chabad House of Delmar, and we have a very special guest with us, Josh Sussman. As you can see, he's a musician. He's holding his violin. Welcome to the Jewish View, Yoshua. Well, actually, this is part two. Unfortunately, if you didn't see part one, it was a beautiful show. We ran out of time. Just to review it for 30 seconds, just saying that we're talking about classic composers, the Baroque. We talked about Bach. Played a little a section from Bach, Haydn, and then we had Felix Mendelssohn. We talked about he was the first major Jewish composer that we know about. And that's really, we left the show. It was such a good time. We were running out of time. That's we needed part two. And I actually would like to even start this show with just general Jewish music. I mean, I hate to bring a joke, Fiddler on the Roof, but really the violin is a very Jewish instrument. You know, I mean, I don't know if that's even clear. I mean, you're the musicologist and I'm just, observing, but, you see Yitzhak Perlman. I mean, you just know about special Jewish violinists. You see in Russia they played the violin. I mean, you feel that's true, or even a reason why that is? I mean, it's just observation.
Sure. The violin has a very intimate connection with the Jewish people, dating back all the way to King David. In the Torah, in the Jewish Bible, one of the major instruments that the Levium played in the Holy Temple was called the nevel. That word, the nevel, appears in several of the Psalms, and most of the great rabbinic commentators identify the nevel with what's by and large the modern violin. The nevel was a bowed stringed instrument, as opposed to its counterpart, the kinnor. The kinnor was a stringed instrument, but it was a plucked instrument. Kind of like a small version of the modern harp. So for thousands of years, the Jewish people has been identified with the nevel, in those days, and the violin as it would become. So then especially in the 19th century, the major violinists and the major violin teachers were Jewish.
They were Jewish. I was right. It really was much of a Jewish instrument.
It was.
I mean,
yeah.
I didn't know it for a fact. Just from a little observation, you always see Jewish people, and even accommodating like it's crude, but the Fiddler on the Roof, But still, it was just the epitome. I mean, I think the fiddler, they wasn't the guitarist on the roof, and stuff like that. I mean, it meant something. That's how it was a Jewish instrument. That's how it was. What about the history of Jewish men? Now, we talked about Felix Mendelssohn, but he was a Jew that played, in the line of other composers. Is there such thing as Jewish music? I guess the only thing that comes to mind is like klezmer. Is that really Jewish? Or I think a lot of things Jewish they picked up from other culture with food, like a bagel. Well, lox. Well, it's Scandinavian. It's just Jews picked it up. It was not really Jewish food. It's just Jews picked it up as food. But I mean, is there such a thing as real Jewish music?
There is. There's a particular sound. There's what's called a mode. A mode is a type of scale that is composed of intervals and of notes that are a little bit different from the standard major scale that is well known in European music. There are different modes all across the world. And it happens to be that there are a few modes that are indigenous to Middle Eastern music. So when Jewish people migrated from the Middle East to Europe and to other places, for instance, in Asia and in Africa, they brought this unique sounding mode or scale to their new homes. So there are many characteristics of Jewish music in these new areas, let's say Eastern Europe, that make that music stand out from its neighbors. So when a person is listening to Hasidic music or to Eastern European Jewish music, they can pick it out immediately as something distinct from the music of, let's say, the Eastern European composers from Poland or from Russia, for instance. And ironically enough, this Jewish sound that is so apparent in Eastern European Jewish music is similar to a sound from North African Jewish music or Iranian Jewish music.
Right. You have an example, or you play klezmer a little bit? I mean, is that part of your repertoire?
So while we're already invoking Fiddler on the Roof,
All right.
it would be a shame not to fulfill it. Okay.
Very good. Some classic Jew. I mean, the Jewish people made it, but it was just really epitome of really Jewish music. It's really klezmer. I mean, it's not classic klezmer. I mean, it's Hollywood. I mean, they made it up and just carry that kind of, like you say, it's just sense it's a Jewish tune.
Sure.
You know, it's classic in that sense. But there were other Jewish musicians, and we dealt with Felix Mendelssohn.
Right, sure.
But who was other well-renowned classic musicians that were Jewish?
Okay. As Mendelssohn kind of opened the door for Jewish musicians, then later on in the 19th century, there were several very, very important Jewish composers. For instance, Gustav Mahler.
I don't even know he was Jewish.
Mahler was Jewish. He incorporated actually some Jewish sounding themes in his symphonies. There's a famous Jewish wedding scene in the slow movement of the First Symphony. The opening to the Fifth Symphony is kind of, unfortunately, like a funeral march, a Jewish funeral march, God forbid. And then we move on to Arnold Schoenberg. He was born a few years after Mahler, and Schoenberg, who was a Jew, he initiated basically the modernist period in music. And later on in his career, let's say starting in the 1930s, he really started to come back to his Jewish spiritual roots, and the majority of his later work has Jewish inspiration. Then you have one of the major French figures from the early 20th century, a composer named Darius Milhaud. He was born in 1892. He was a Jewish composer and also wrote several Jewish-influenced pieces.
You can hear you can hear that in the music. You know, when you say Jewish influence, I mean, you can sense it.
In the Milhaud, it's a little difficult. That sounds more French and cosmopolitan, but he did compose vocal works that have Jewish liturgy as their lyrics. Probably even a greater contribution of Jewish personalities to classical music than being composers, great composers. I would even say the majority of the great conductors and performers of the first half of the 20th century were Jews. You have some of the greatest conductors of all time from the early 20th century who were Jewish. You have Bruno Walter, Otto Klemperer, Georg Schulte.
I didn't know these people were Jewish. So yeah, so they were performing besides composers. They're conductors
And performers.
Right.
The great violinists were Jews. Misha Elman, Yasha Heifetz, Nathan Milstein.
Let me ask you something. I remember a question what always came up that, we talk about the classics, but nowadays you don't. I mean, maybe you say differently, but I don't know. I mean, you don't hear, anybody like Bach or Beethoven nowadays. I know they do compose. I mean, maybe you'll say they're just as good in a different style. I mean, what's your, you hear that, like in 1700, 1800s, like we say, and even in the 20th century, you don't, or the latter half of the 20th century, you don't hear. I mean, there's Leonard Bernstein, I guess.
Sure.
Besides that, why is it? Or people aren't into violin that much. They're not into composing. They're playing Beatles music, maybe they're giving their talents to somewhere else. That's what people say. They're not, those geniuses in music are doing something else. I mean, is that true even? I don't know of what, musicology would say, would saying, oh no, there's some real great music. It's just a different period of music nowadays. They're doing something else. It's not in the style of Bach.
Sure. Well, there is kind of one historical rule or law that we always have to take into account, and that is that when you're in the thick of a particular time period, it's very difficult to assess that time period when one is in it. Kind of like you can hold up an object in front of your eyes so close that you can't even recognize what the object is, and that's funny because it's never been closer to you. So there is the idea that maybe we need a little bit of distance from a particular period in order to assess it accurately. But on the other hand, there are some signs that we're in a slightly less creative historical period right now. There have been periods of cultural history where production has not been at the standard that it was either before or that it would be after. Let's say from 1600 to 1650. There are 50 years where, while there are some major artistic figures who stand out, no one would say that it was as great as fertile a period as, let's say, from 1700 to 1750 or 1900 to 1950. So it could be that.
Hello.
Exactly.
Yeah. Interesting. You think, do you see youth? You're a young person yourself, and like you say, you've been around to universities and Interlochen. Are kids into, violin or, the classic instruments? I'm not saying they like their music, guitars and all that, and the drums, but this is classic violin and even piano, maybe you would even say.
Sure. I think that the modern educational system in the public schools has possibly done something of a disservice to classic music, in that in my father's generation and in the generation who went to school around the mid 20th century, there were mandatory music and art appreciation courses in high school and in college.
Right.
Nowadays, a student can get by in high school and in college never having heard a piece by Mozart, never having read a play by Shakespeare, and adults grow up not having had a sound exposure to classic music and maybe some of the other arts. So I would say that the modern students in these times are a bit less familiar with the classics than they were in yesteryear.
So therefore the talent may not, so maybe there's a genius somewhere that just never got exposed to the violin or the music and doing something else, or playing rock and roll music over here. Man, who knows over here? It's interesting because, that question does come up, that where are all the great composers today?
Right.
There is new music being played, isn't there? New compositions being, people are writing them.
Absolutely. One of the big campaigns for American orchestras these days, and in fact, the Albany Symphony truly is at the forefront of this campaign, is to play as much new American indigenous music as they can. So the Albany Symphony incorporates a new American piece into, I believe, every concert.
Just to get it out there, so people recognize it, not just to go to a Mozart concert, but they put in something else.
Exactly.
That's very interesting.
I think so, yeah.
Well, we like always Jewish music. You have any other little Jewish tunes over there? Maybe I'll start dancing here. You better look out over here, right on the TV. I get myself moving too much.
Sure.
I do like classics also. People shouldn't think that I'm just music. I do. I play piano, and I was given an appreciation of classic music when I was young. I think you're right about that. People just, maybe a bigger, broader idea of the educational system nowadays.
Right.
They're lacking in basics sometimes. They don't know who the vice president is. They don't know what they're learning other things, but just grounding themselves in basic literature, basic music. Before you go on to modern things, you have to be grounded in the classics. But I think it's a broader issue.
Sure.
Whatever, but still like Jewish stuff.
I can't blame you. So, in particular, I've taken a very unique interest in the nigunim, the melodies of Chabad Hasidism. That's the Jewish music that really drew me into the world of Jewish music on a wider scale. So I think it would be nice to play one nigun.
Really beautiful.
This particular melody details the exchange between the Baal Shem Tov, who was the founder of the Hasidic movement in the 1730s and 1740s. The story goes that the Baal Shem ascended to heaven, and he wanted to ask the Messiah already, when are you coming? We've been waiting for you for such a long time. We're all waiting on pins and needles. We'd like to know when you're coming. So the Messiah himself said to the Baal Shem, when your teachings spread out throughout the entire world, even to the furthest flung corners of the world, then I'll come. That's the anecdote associated with this melody.
of the soul over here. So tell us about Hasidic music. I mean, because that is, people know Hasidic music festivals. There was a very big, actually, innovation in a certain sense to bring in like deeper music. I mean, this is 250 years ago. Right at really the same time the classics were, really moving up on the scene. But Hasidic music is stirring for the soul. Tell us a little bit more about the role of music in Hasidic life.
Sure. One major idea that Hasidism teaches about music is that sometimes words or lyrics can actually be a constraint on a melody. There is a noticeable difference between a Hasidic Shabbat table and a non-Hasidic Jewish Shabbat table. One conspicuous difference is that a Hasidic table will have melodies without any of the liturgical lyrics normally associated with a Shabbat table. Whereas a Jewish home, another Jewish home, may have a lot of melodies that are still associated with that melody's lyrics. The reason being is that as soon as one starts singing a melody with a particular image or a particular word or phrase associated with that melody, then in the ear and in the mind of the singer and the listener, that melody is always associated with that particular idea, and sometimes it's difficult for a listener or a singer to break free from those connotations. Whereas in a Hasidic melody, in a nigun, which more often than not doesn't have any of the lyrics that are associated with other songs, those connotations and those what can be sometimes constraints aren't encumbering that melody. So the singer can vocalize on that melody in a free and unconstrained manner.
You have one more, I think we have a few more minutes for one more nigun, and it'll end us off on a very spiritual high note.
Sure. This nigun, which is called Anim Zmirais, which translates into English from the Hebrew as I will weave melodies, I will sing, I will weave tunes, is actually the first, it comes from the first verse of a poem, a liturgical poem written in the 12th century in Germany by a poet named Judah the Chassid, Yehuda HaChassid. And this melody is one of the first melodies originally that made me so interested in Hasidic music. It's a bit more, it's a bit slower and quieter than the previous nigun.
Wonderful. Well, we're just out of time over here. Perfect timing. I think part two we could call Jewish music, and I wanted to get to that. But really, you're an expert in both classic and Jewish, and there's probably was a little bit interlinking between the two. I mean, they were both in Europe, and they're just, there must be some kind of, some people working with both ways, a two-way street. Do you ever feel that way, or the classics to Jewish music, or Jewish music picking up a little on the classics, or the music that it was there? Because they do, there are some tunes that are very close to European, I mean, the Ger Hasidim, I've heard that, very, very close.
Absolutely. The two cultures kind of had something of a give and take, and the two were very close.
Harmonized. All right,
That's
thank
right.
you very much. We're out of time, unfortunately. Even we get 2 parts, and we still need to talk more. But maybe in the future we'll get together again. And I just want to thank again Josh Sussman, the musician, violinist, and to be on the Jewish View. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.